So welcome, and thank you for making the trip for us this evening.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Not that I can see any of you, but I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you are alive through that film.
I know, it's a remarkable. So few films really hold up a couple of years, and I can't believe we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of this film, and it holds up amazing. It's a tribute to, obviously, the story of Oscar Romero, but the screenwriting and all the other artists who contributed to the film. Just a quick question. Obviously, Oscar Romero was canonized last year. Did you go to Rome for the canonization?
I did not. I did not.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's two towering priests in this film. There's obviously the one on screen, Saint Oscar Romero. But you really can't talk about this film without talking about the other priest behind this film, Father Elward Buzz Kaiser, known as the Pope of Pacific Heights in California.
Pacific Palisades. How many other questions are you thinking of possibly asking me?
Well, I think this one might last us.
That's right. We may never get to another one. Elwood Bud Kaiser was he was 6'5" or 6'6", German descent. He was, I would say, literally and figuratively deaf. He wore a hearing aid, but he also only heard what he wanted to hear. So if you look at people in Hollywood, when he died, there was a memorial service, and I would say 8 or 9 of the most illustrious writers spoke, and basically they all sort of told versions of the same story. Do you know the book Anna Karenina? There's the opening line of Anna Karenina is something like, all happy families are alike and every unhappy family is unique in its own way. We all said no to Father Bud Kaiser in our own way, and he, of course, never heard the word no because he was, in his own way, literally and figuratively deaf. So you would say to him, no, I can't do it, I'm too busy, I won't do it, no, 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 no. He never heard it, and you ended up doing it, whatever it was that he wanted. And in my case, that led to this film, and it would not have been made without him. He's the one who sort of, the beginning of it was when Oscar Romero was assassinated. I had met him, I had won something called the Humanitas Prize, which he had started. He invited me to lunch, which was a little bit like, really, that at that time, Humanitas Prize had a cash reward, or if you won it, you got this amount of money. And the joke about Bud Kaiser was that, in fact, when he handed you the check, he never let go of it. And you ultimately gave it back to him. But this lunch was sort of like that. Was he waiting for the check? You know, was I waiting for it, or was he waiting for it? But it led me to, I think about him. He wanted to know who I was, what was I thinking, what did I care about, what did I want to write about, and why. Anyway, so it led me at some point, when Oscar Romero was assassinated in 1980, I called him up and I said, he said he did a show called Insight that ran in the days when Sunday morning television was basically free. And it ran for 23 years. And that's the same story as he got noted writers, noted directors, noted actors to appear for essentially nothing in stories that had some kind of human or spiritual content. And anyway, he said he would like to do at that time a big deal in television was Movies of the Week. And I said, this might be a great story. And he, of course, said, will you write it? And I was very busy at the time, and I said no. And he went away, but 2 or 3 years later, he came back. And I think he may have hired another writer or whatever happened. And I said initially, you need someone to write it who knows Central America, who speaks fluent Spanish. When he came back, he said he had tried that. And he said, you know, the whole thing about writing is that you try and learn as you're writing. So there was a challenge there. There was a challenge in dealing with him. There was a challenge in the material. And that challenge led us together to go to El Salvador in 1984, I think it was. And it was still a very dangerous place. We were there with press credentials from a Catholic magazine, but also from Rolling Stone magazine. And if you can picture this 6'5" or 6'6", semi-deaf Catholic priest with Rolling Stone credentials, I mean, it's pretty funny.
You know, obviously the film was ultimately directed by John Digan, an Australian director, but Father Bud had been in conversation with the legendary John Huston to direct the film. I heard there were conversations with he had contacted other directors like Martin Scorsese. But as amazing and as extraordinary as the story of Oscar Romero is, as you're alluding to, the story behind the making of this film was also extraordinary. Can you talk a little bit about the trip down to El Salvador, the research you did, some of the characters that you encountered down there?
At that time, one of the things about being American going there then is you had a remarkable access. So we saw the ambassador, and we saw, there's a character in here who's called a colonel, but it was based on General Garcia, who was a man who's a general who said he knew Romero. He had said, Romero, just what, like in the film, if you calm down, if you stop, it's all going to work out. And Romero, he said, you do that. And Romero supposedly said, well, if you resign, I will do that. And of course, Garcia said, well, I'm not going to resign. Garcia, like many of the people that we met, many of the people that were there who were wealthy or wanted to be wealthy, who were in what was called the sort of oligarchy, had been educated or wanted to be educated in America. And their dream, in a way, was to drive a big American car and, if you will, sort of marry Marilyn Monroe. And they had this vision of America that they were actually enacting who and what we are. There was, that sort of profound misconception that still has the trail of sort of a truth through it, because that is an element of who we are, and hopefully not a dominant one. So we met a man named Roberto D'Abasson, who was never convicted and never pinpointed, but was felt to be the one who was behind the assassination of Romero. And it was at a cocktail party. He was charismatic. He was smoking. We talked to him. I mean, it was this sort of crazy world, as well as talking to, the next Archbishop, Rivera Damas, who's mentioned in the film. So we had access. One of the ones that was most fun was there was at the Catholic University there was Father Elacuria, whose opening line was, hey, I'm glad you're here, let's win an Oscar for Oscar. And he was a wonderfully erudite and had a great strain of humor and humility. And 4 years later, he and several other priests from the university were led out and not just killed. I mean, they were essentially mutilated by the fire of automatic weapons. Some, afterwards, it was like one had been shot right out of because it was in the morning, out of his bathroom, his slippers, his bedroom slippers. And, several of their faces were almost obliterated. And that's one of the things that in the movie may seem very intense, but it was true. And if anything, we had to sort of be careful to both not so much overstate as understate the numbers of Los Desaparecidos, the sort of, almost ritualistic torture that went on during that time period. And that what led this meek man, Oscar Romero, which was what everyone said he was, this milquetoast guy, to, against his will, become an entirely different being and this remarkable, ultimately, hero.
It's interesting how you bring that up because, this whole resurgence in faith-based films over the past decade or so, a lot of people trace back to the phenomenal popularity of Mel Gibson's Scorsese, The Passion of the Christ. But this film was made a decade before that, so it was a pioneering film when you think about it. I mean, this was a film with a major studio behind it, Warner Brothers, an A-list star, studio-level production quality to it. Was there difficulty in getting the studio behind something like this? Because at that point, they didn't know if the faith audience was going to turn out for something like this.
Don't think it was easy for a second. It took 5 years to get made, and it was because of Bud Kaiser that it did get made. It is actually a very low-budget film. Warner Brothers only came in after another sort of production company poured in some money. So they had a belief in it, but it wasn't like they're going, okay, yeah, we're in. No, they were sort of dragged, I think, with their best intentions or their best feelings, but so a reluctance because of what it was and how sort of, I would use the word almost authentic it was. Or
Yeah,
is.
there's a verisimilitude to this that's really,
Yeah. So it wasn't like Warner Bros. Warner Bros. Came in when I think they felt they had a safe investment as well as they were doing something worthwhile. It wasn't like they were instantly there.
Did Father Bud have any reservations? Because obviously, in a lot of the interviews that I've read, he and all the people behind the creation of the film did not want to create just a faith movie. I mean, they wanted to create a great drama that just happened to deal with a religious subject. But obviously, there must have been in mind that this would be a film that would appeal to faith audiences. So to include, some of the intense violence, the very powerful images of the bodies, was there hesitancy on his part to include elements like that?
I think he worried about it. His focus and the struggles. I can remember when we were editing. The film was largely shot in and around Cuernavaca in Mexico. And we were editing the film there, and he and I got into screaming matches. And I'm from New England, where the entire goal is to take silence to sort of a higher and higher level. I think in my father's life, ultimately, taciturnity, complete silence would have been nirvana. And Bud was just the opposite. So somehow he got out of this writer, me, screaming, spitting arguments, of course, which he didn't hear. But it was that he wanted the words to be essentially homily, and the struggle was, and I sometimes think it was successful and sometimes not. For me, among the most powerful things in this film are the scenes that were written either large or small, the taking back of the sacrament large, or even the moments, and this is in the script, when Ana Alicia, the actress, is in the car and her husband's body is put into the trunk, and the car goes up or down with the weight of that, and it breaks her down. To me, those are some of the finest things in the film, both large and small. Sometimes the words, dialogue, which is what you think writers are, I'm not always happy with. Other cases, because they're still, to me, a little, what's the phrase we like to use, on the nose.
Yeah.
But in other instances, they're very powerful. The scene with Tony Plana when he says, I'm now, what else can I do but become essentially a revolutionary? And Raul goes, you're not defending, you're attacking. To me, there's a real power and truth in that scene. But so I think he was worried about it, but ultimately I think the rest of us and the locations itself and the preparation and whether it's the production design is in most cases fabulous, the music is terrific, the sound design, there's a lot of sound design. If you noticed, it was done by Lucas, essentially. I think sort of at times overwhelmed him, and we kept having to saying, you're not in the pulpit. This is a movie. This is a story of a man, a reluctant hero. This is a man who was standing on a diving board and was pushed and eventually realized they're gonna shove him off, and he's backing up along diving board. And finally he said, okay, you know what? If this is gonna happen, I'm gonna turn around and I'm gonna dive. That it's that. And I was and still we talked about a big fan of the movie A Man for All Seasons and the story of Thomas More. And if you see the movie, the play is a little different, but if you see the movie, it is Paul Scofield keep trying to not have to do or admit something that he doesn't want to admit. And he does it very, until he's in the corner, ultimately, when he says, hey, to be a man, and there's a speech about, I hold myself in my hand, and ultimately if I spread my fingers, it runs out between them, and there's nothing left.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, obviously, people could also make connections between Bishop Romero and Thomas Becket, who was, before Romero, the last bishop who was killed while on the altar back in the 12th century. But the connections to A Man for All Seasons are striking. And we can talk maybe a little bit more about that later.
And to get out of sort of the Christianity from it, if I grew up, for whatever reason, going on Saturday afternoons when I was allowed to go to the movies to what were then, I guess for kids, or not kids, but, whatever I was, 11 or 12 or 13 or something, there were a lot of Westerns. And if you go to Western movies, at some point, like there's a very famous movie called High Noon, it's not that dissimilar a story to a man who has to feels like his integrity, his whole self is tied up into some action that he feels is worthy and necessary.
Yeah. I don't think even a movie like this, we were talking backstage, a movie like this could be made today. I mean, it's that kind of human drama that has just, unfortunately, does not seem to have a place on the large screen, although, as you said, Bud Kaiser had been known up until this point for his work on television. And I think I read that he was afraid that as he was turning his attention to the big screen, he might not be taken as seriously. Ironically, today, all the filmmakers who want to be taken seriously are turning to television. And you had said in an interview that if you were going to try to tackle this project today, you would want to do it as a television miniseries in a longer format. Could you talk about how you might tackle something like this today?
Well, you could do this across time in a couple ways. You heard right at the beginning, the man is Remember Matanza, which was in the 1930s. And you could open with a sequence that would take place then to show sort of how things can repeat themselves. We're talking about it. You look at this film now, and if you look up what's happening in El Salvador right this minute, it seems not very far from the 1970s. And you think about what's happened in this country, it seems remarkably pertinent. Well, there seems to be a replication of that, and wouldn't it be important to make that clear? Also, Romero, in his meekness, in his unhappiness, there were a couple of things. He was very sickly, and he actually went to Mexico and saw a therapist. And that, we didn't know how to get that into the story without it seeming like a sidebar. But I think in a miniseries, it'd be really interesting. What was that like? Who was the person that he talked to? What did it help or do for him? That's one thing. Another is the role of the United States. I did not want to have one of these things where there's, suddenly a big American actor comes on for a minute and you feel like you've lost the core of this movie. So that was a fight to not have that. But the United States is, behind the scenes, is all over the place in terms of, you heard about the money for the military arms. But we were both the good guys and the bad guys. I talked about the dream of, what is it to be an American in maybe the worst sort of stereotype. But we were sending money. We were, saying that communism could take over Central America the same way that, if the domino falls in Vietnam, all the rest of Asia will fall. We are very guilty of that. And there were other more pertinent things. Before Romero was assassinated, if I have my time right, there were the 4 nuns, who were driving from the airport and were basically waylaid and raped and killed. And there's been I think somewhere a movie or a play about them. There was other things that Roberto de Abasan was partly educated in this country. A lot of El Salvadorans were. So there's a cross flow that would be really interesting in a miniseries to see if you would explore that.
There's so much, it's such a rich, complex story that I guess the impulse, particularly with such a public figure as Romero, is to try to create almost a documentary. And narrative film is not documentary. And as a screenwriter, how do you navigate that? How do you say that sometimes certain things have to be slightly finessed, certain dramatic licenses have to be taken to really communicate the deeper truth about the character, even if things need to be shifted? There had been several articles saying that Romero's conversion had been evolving over a longer period of time, whereas in the movie, the sort of the prompt is the murder of his good friend, Father Rutilio. And you're both ways, the documentary and the film, are telling the same truth, but they just have to approach that truth in different ways. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think actually, if you look at the scene where he goes to Grande's, where he's laid out with the little boy and the old man, it's not Grande that turns him. It's the little boy's father who comes and says, I want to take him to his mother. And I felt all the way through this that it's not, Grande represented something, and if you're telling it in sort of Christian terms, he was sort of John the Baptist. But Jesus, if he's represented in Oscar Romero, it was again the small things. It was when he couldn't decide, he talks to Lucia about, what would you do? He asks advice. It was always sort of the ordinary person that helped make him extraordinary. It wasn't just Rutilio Grande. And we should talk about Raul Julia a little bit too, who, Raul Julia was a big man, Romero was not. And he managed to, through glasses and through composure and through the way he moved his body, to seem smaller. If you took those glasses off and took Raul at the end of a day. I mean, he was not a partier in a wild way, but he had an energy that was remarkable. And I think the role affected him tremendously. And I think it actually helped bring him back to the church. There are quotes of that. I never talked to him specifically about that. And the man who played Rutilio Grande is a guy named Richard Jordan. And Richard Jordan also was a very big character. His head was big. He had gone to Harvard. He had hands. He was like, if you went to dinner with Richard Jordan, you were drinking before dinner. And in the dinner itself was enough alcohol to put you away. And yet he was also a carpenter. He was a remarkable man. And what I always thought was so interesting, he was so smart or so intelligent. His real name wasn't Richard Jordan. His real name was Robert Jordan. And his mother had been very close to Martha Gellhorn, who was the third wife of Ernest Hemingway. And the major character in For Whom the Bell Tolls is Robert Jordan. Richard Jordan, I think, felt that novel was so important that he didn't want to be caught in the light of it. He didn't want people to know about the fact that the name had a correspondence. So he changed his name to Richard Jordan, which I have found to be sort of something that's so intelligent and yet so unnecessary.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, so much of this film is the performance, the masterful performance. He really inhabits that role. But another character is, as you said, is the location itself, and the people. I read somewhere that originally when he was Father Budd was contemplating this as maybe a TV project, I read that one executive said it wouldn't work because there's no love interest. I beg to differ. I think the love interest, beyond obviously his love for God, was his love for the people. And the faces are so authentic. They add so much to this film, even the cutaway shots. So can you talk a little bit about how it was working in Mexico? And I understand that there were many talented people, including a future Oscar winner, was the assistant director, Alfonso Cuarón, who just won last year for Roma.
Yeah, well, everybody basically, except for Raul was paid, I think, $100,000. Someone said, I think his agent called and said, well, he gets $100,000 a week. And the response from Bud, or I think, let's say Bud, it was, okay, he's going to get now, I'll tell you what, for 8 weeks work, he's going to get $100,000. And everyone else worked for basically actors or writers or directors minimum. So whatever that was, for a film or for the week. So everyone did it out of a belief that there was something here to be told. There was something that needed to be said. And I think that has to do with the content and also has to do with, and I think that applies even to in Mexico. And Mexico is very difficult. It's not without a certain thing called corruption. You get the army involved and money moves in very strange ways. And John Digan, the director, deserves credit for, I think, the faces and finding those that are, in a sense, exactly what you say. They are the people, they are the campesinos, they are representing those. And it's not thousands, it's tens of thousands that disappeared. Yeah. One of the things that was most moving, and we couldn't find it in Mexico, was a place that we visited in El Salvador called El Playón. And El Playón was basically a lava bed where the lava is all black. It's old, it hasn't fallen recently. And we went there first thing in the morning, and what do you hear as you're coming toward this? You get it, and you had to have a bodyguard to go there. The first thing you hear was like the sound of, it wasn't thunder, what is it? And it was the clapter, is there such a word? Clapter of wings of the birds that had been looking around for the dead bodies of the vultures. And it was entirely black, and when you walked on it, it had that strange feeling of lava that's almost like you're walking on glass that won't break. The edges that almost feel like they're going to be sharp under your soles of your shoes. And that particular morning that we were there wasn't, quote, a lot of fresh meat, but what there was people searching for their loved ones, their brother, their sister, their father, their son. And there were some skeletons, and the color, if they'd been, dried out and stripped by birds in time, they were a white that was whiter than white. It just was remarkable. And of course, the whole place was blacker than black. It was like a black moon. And we couldn't find that. But what we did instead, as you saw, is create this sort of, garbage pit or junkyard with all in the wind, that I think was an amazingly analogous, successful character in the movie.
Wow. You know, one thing that's always struck me is, particularly in modern Hollywood, there seems to be a gravitational pull among writers towards, darker subject matter, darker characters, cynical characters. And I always remember reading an essay by J.R.R. Tolkien, the great author and Catholic author, had said that what he tried to do with his work was to do just the opposite, to show the banality of evil and to make virtue attractive. And I think you do that extremely well in this film. He's not one-dimensional. He's a human being. He has his flaws, but you really make virtue and a profound human heroism attractive. Can you talk about a writer about having to, not make hagiography, but at the same time really celebrate that heroism and that virtue?
I don't know if this is a direct answer to that, but I think of one of the fictional creations is the Salada family, and I did not want it to seem like there are only bad guys out there and he's alone. That it worked both ways. There was evil, I think that's almost the appropriate word, on both sides in the middle of this carnage. So that family that was wealthy, I mean, there's lots to say. You could hear in Harold Gould's performance, the father, some of that sort of rigidity. But at the same time, things happened on both sides, on all sides. And in a sense, Romero had to sort of try and navigate that, like in mythology, like how to get between Scylla and Charybdis. And to me, that's a kind of heroism.
Yeah. Do you have we were talking about that you've seen this film numerous times, but over the years, is there one scene that still stands out to you? You've said that this film, among your many projects, is probably one of the ones that you're most proud of. So is there that moment that's still kind of either just you feel is still very touching, or, yeah, I got that scene right? I mean, the scene that stands out to me the most comes after the scene where he's talking with the Tony Plana character, and he's walking alone and he sees the three crosses. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was Orson Welles, the great director, who said the two things that are most difficult to communicate on film are human intimacy and prayer. And I think, when he falls down on his knees and those three almost whispered words, I can't, you must, I'm yours, I thought was a remarkable moment in a film with many remarkable moments. But is there one that stands out to you?
Well, I'm going to sort of repeat what you just said in a way. You mentioned at the beginning of the last year, got this thing called the Kaiser Award, which is named after this 6'7" guy that I smile and laugh at, but I also could curse probably it simultaneously. But Kaiser is when I won the award. They said, well, you put together clips from your career, and we want to show like 5 minutes of them or something. And I had not seen the film. I think there was a screening like on its 20th anniversary or something. And it was exactly that scene that I asked an editor to pull together some stuff who I'd worked with many times. And he had that scene included as a possibility for this 5 minutes. And it knocked me out. There's something so spare about it. I always think, again, maybe it's that New England thing that, it's not always the words in film. It's about the silence and the faces. It's not only about action, it's about the reaction to that action. And what is that scene but exactly that? I mean, it's a man at the end of his rope asking for help, asking for, what door do I go through? What road do I take? What is next? And then, of course, you find out that he's turned around on that diving board. So that's a very powerful one. Yeah. I think of the scene when they take back the Eucharist. I, of course, having directed, had sort of discussions with John Digan about how to sort of, some ways, do it differently to make it even more confrontational and to build it a slightly different way. But that's typical of a writer and a director looking at any material that he isn't or doesn't think he's in complete control of. Sometimes it's the little moments that sometimes it's just a moment or even a look between Jordan and Raul that moves me. So sometimes it's almost the power of the human face in movies that I find so why I do what I do.
Well, like you say in the audio commentary to the film multiple times, the great line from John Ford, shoot the faces, shoot the faces. Well, this is a very sacramental film. I mean, I think you get every sacrament in there except for marriage and confirmation. It's there. But you also speak a lot in many interviews you've done about the power of story, the power of art. And I just want to go back one more minute to Man for All Seasons. You quoted that wonderful line where Thomas is speaking with his daughter and trying to explain why he has to take this stand. But there's a quote by Robert Bolt, the playwright, and he's talking, and it's amazing. I always thought that the most amazing Catholic film and play ever written was written by an agnostic. And in the introduction to the print version of the play, he's talking about why, as an agnostic, he was drawn to the character of Thomas More, St. Thomas More. And he said that Thomas More had an adamantine sense of his own self. He knew where he began and where he left off, what areas of himself he could yield, but at length he was asked to retreat from that final area where he located his very self, and he could no more be budged than off a cliff. Than a cliff. Why today do you think this film about someone, whether you're Catholic or not, religious or not, the idea of having that strength of your conviction, that idea of speaking truth to power, why this film, why St. Oscar Romero's film speaks so strongly to audiences today, or why it should at least?
Well, I'm not a Catholic, and I think that for me, that somewhere in the universe is a spirit, whatever that is. I mean, in talking about Bud Kaiser, I told him when I met him, I'm not a Catholic. I'm not actually I majored in religion in college. Yeah, I was a crucifer in the Episcopal Church, and I even taught Sunday school for a year. And he's sort of looking, nodding, yeah, okay. But you don't believe anything now. I said, no, I like to write about that sort of darkness where people are really tested. And then he says, well, what's at the end of the darkness? Well, maybe there's the bad phrase from the Vietnam War would be there's light at the end of the tunnel. He said, there's light at the end of the tunnel. So he said, you're a believer. See, so I think in a sense that great story is when you take a character and that character goes on a journey, and the journey is a discovery about what is outside of him, but even more equally is what is the journey inside himself and what he finds there. And to me, that's storytelling. It's almost like a sacrament. What's the definition, at least in the Episcopal Church, is an outward and spiritual
of an inner reality.
On an inner and spiritual, outward, say a symbol or thing on an inward spiritual grace. Well, that's in a sense the journey of all great stories.
Well, the line in Christianity is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. And this, Oscar Romero, in his own way, sort of incarnates that message as well.
By the way, every time he speaks as a homily, whether it's over the radio in person, those are as close as possible to his exact words. Obviously, they're translated into English from Spanish, but those are not made up by me. I once wrote a miniseries, and it had a lot of Senate testimony in it, and there was an actor named Brian Dennehy, and I come in the morning, and I've been drinking with him the night before. Actually, he had been drinking, and I had been trying to survive his drinking. And I get it there in the morning, and he says, here comes John Sacret Young. I've got 7 pages of dialogue here by someone named Senator Don Regal. He's barely coming to this set, and he didn't even write them, because they were from congressional testimony. But in this instance, some of those powerful words are most often and most right on Oscar Romero.
Wow. Well, you talk about taking a journey with story, and you've lived with this film for decades now. Has living with St. Oscar Romero's story changed you at all? Has it changed your thoughts about things and your own journey in life? What was the effect of this film on you?
I don't know if this applies exactly. It's sort of a roundabout answer, is that sometimes do you write something to remember it, or do you write it to forget it? when you write something in a way, like you're I think, hoping to put it on a shelf, and it will have a place on the shelf, but you're moving on from that. I think one of the things about this movie is it's very hard for me to watch. It's very hard for me to watch because I see still the imperfections or the things that I would be still arguing with Father Kaiser about. On the other hand, there is, I believe, an authenticity into it and a ruggedness that is very unusual and unique, and that I would say, hey, if I could do that on another project in the same ways or with the same truth, I'd be very proud.
Well, I want to open up the floor to some questions from the audience. I know we have some students here who are going to be studying Oscar Romero in a week or so. So there is a microphone over on house left. So if you have a question, if you want to work your way over there, and while we're having some people work their way over, I do want to make one quick announcement. I know there's some young adults here, and there will be a young adult fellowship social down the block. If you're interested in participating, whether you signed up or not, or whether you're hearing about it for the first time, Elena here in the audience, she's raising her hand there. She'll be the point person. She's going to be waiting in the lobby right through the exit doors here. So if you're interested, just speak to Elena afterwards. So we have a question.
Yeah. Before the film started, I was just thinking about how incredibly little we're generally taught about the history and political realities of El Salvador and Central America and South America, for really specific reasons, I would imagine. So I was just really curious, in the spirit of like self-education, if there were any specific people or books or documents that you looked to in your research in the process of telling the story, and also if there was anything you learned in the process of researching the story that surprised you along the way.
A couple things. One is there's audio of his homilies that exist, and there are, I think, books that have them, and you can see how powerful they are. He also kept a diary, and I believe there is a published version of that or excerpts from it. So I know I saw it. I think, but at that time it wasn't published. So those were invaluable. I mean, research, you go to the primary source in every instance that you can. What you learn from it, of course, is that I think there's a couple things. One is, we in this country, and maybe it's not only we, seem to not remember things for very long. I mean, if I look out here in the audience, I'm of sort of the Vietnam generation, but what do any of you all know about Vietnam? But on the other hand, why should you? So it is somewhat a storyteller's task to say, let me put something into your memory and see if I or we who are making this or doing this can keep it there for a while, maybe to pass on, because we tend to forget. We tend to not remember things that are important, and I think that applies to storytelling, and that there are stories that right now, it isn't a question of, as a writer, of red or blue or black or white. It is that there are truths out there. Some of them are funny, and some of them are dark, and some of them are the knuckles of the best of human experience, that we need to tell those stories. And if I thought I needed to do that in the 1980s when we were struggling to get this movie made, I think the imperative to do it now is as great, or maybe even greater. And we must never, never, never stop telling the important stories in whatever mode it is.
Thank you. Do you have another question? Yes, we have one coming, working their way over there.
First of all, I'd like to thank you. The movie was really very well done. It's difficult to put his life in context in 2 hours. Probably you're familiar with the fact that after his death, during the funeral, the wake and funeral at the cathedral, there was this extreme mass shooting. Probably 200 people died over there. Is there any reason why that part of, I guess, his legacy was left out?
Well, I think the reason that sequence was not included was probably that we had a ton of darkness in this movie, and you saw that, and it was I think authentically graphic enough, and his words were the hope rather than show the sort of violence that continued. It did not stop with his death. However, as he said, you know, he lives on in the Salvadoran people. In a sense, his spirit, if you look at the fact that he's, you know, he's now Saint Oscar, if you will, and it wasn't an Oscar for Oscar, but it was a saint for Oscar, that is alive. That is the match that was lit. That is the torch that is still, you know, bearing. And I think that, so therefore, that seemed like the wrong note to end the film on. And in a way, if you look at the beginning of the film, that was our sense of saying, look, when people are saying freedom, 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 and there's shots breaking out, it's almost, that was a way to say a preliminary echo of what you're talking about. And that's part of what dramatist does. You have to make decisions of what is the story you finally are telling? What is the message or the hope that you hope is in it, or what is not? You know, and I think that our goal was to say that if you look at this man at the end of his life, he was unified in who he was, what his mission was, and how he was speaking out to those he cared about and loved wherever they were in his country, and now in terms of the movie and our ways beyond that, you know, beyond the literal.
Thank you. Really good movie.
We have time for one more question. Does anybody have a question? Anyone from the students?
So I have a question for students. Do you have, like, you have to wear ties? Yeah?
Yeah.
And girls, are you still awake down there? I can't see. Or guys, or whatever you are? Is it okay? Do you know anything about Oscar Romero before this? You've had enough probably by now, yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll be interested to know what you learn when you study him, because there's probably, since I was doing my research, I'm sure there's new books and new stuff, but he was remarkable. So I hope you get a glimpse of that here and find out some more next week if that's what you're up to.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think it was Tony, the actor Tony Plano, who said that you cannot brush up against someone like St. Oscar Romero and not leave unchanged. So, you know, on behalf of the Sheen Center, on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for telling this story, for continuing to tell this story. At the canonization, there were some pilgrims, and Pope Francis spoke to them, and he said that we all have to be martyrs because a martyr is a witness. And I want to thank you through your ministry of writing, your ministry of art, to share Oscar Romero's witness and your own witness. I think in the end, I'm going to take that line away. We didn't get an Oscar for Oscar, but we got a saint for Oscar, and I think it was the better of the two. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for being with us tonight.